Alrighty, here we are. Good afternoon, everybody. So happy you could join us. Welcome to the first of 3 expanded dialogues today, reflecting on uncertain environs, uncertain selves. I'll let the organizers contextualize this event in a minute, but first, welcome to our virtual channel. For those of you unfamiliar with Concordia's fourth space, we are physically located on unceded Indigenous land in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, and operate as a university-wide platform to activate research, teaching, and initiatives so as to connect the public with the inner workings of a university in terms of the various ideas, projects, and cross-disciplinary ventures brewing inside of labs, studios, and classrooms. Little promo bit, check us out on concordia.ca/4 for upcoming activities, and I'll post the links to our Facebook and YouTube channels where streams and recordings of this event can be found in a minute. All communication channels have been activated in this space for you today. So we have the chat, the Q&A, and the virtual hand raising so that you might be unmuted to speak. Everything is on, and we welcome your participation in this expanded conversation. And on that note, to tell you a bit more about it, let me hand proceedings over to Fitton. Over to you. Welcome.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for the welcome. So just to give you a quick moment of explanation of the Expanded Dialogues project. The past year has been a transformative one for our lives. On the one hand, it's rendered the idea of ourselves in the world as we know uncertain. And on the other hand, the pandemic has made us very much hermetically sealed off from one another. Most immediately, we don't have the kind of spontaneity and productive uncertainty of university life that comes with being physically present in a site. What I mean by that is that there's no running into people, being introduced to new acquaintances, chance discoveries of shared interests, or discovering surprising links of research. And these are, especially for academics, these are often the seeds that blossom into research collaboration. So we propose this space, Expanded Dialogues, as a way for such accidental encounters, as well as a kind of a way to create an interrogation of notions of uncertainty and selfhood. Our first dialogue today, Uncertain Environs, Uncertain Selves, seeks to explore these issues through this space. The format, as we kind of run it, is we start off, we have 6 participants total. Our first 2 conversants are going to talk for about 15 minutes. That's Christopher Gutierrez and Madeline Longman. That's going to run for about 15 minutes or so. And then, as we call it, Expanded Dialogues, the dialogue is going to expand to include 4 more people who can come in. Emily Croft, Marie Lecuyer, Matthew Raymond, and Adine Guntori. And then that's going to run for another third of the event. And then in the last third, we're going to open it up into the audience, and we'll bring in any audience members who've been commenting in the chat box. So I'm going to hand it over now to both Christopher and Madeline. So you two can start off however you wish.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for organizing this. It's really great to be here and great to talk to you, Christopher.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, that was a really wonderful and sort of very generous introduction to this conversation, which I'm excited about. So Madeline, I didn't really prepare where we wanted to start this dialogue, but I wonder if you, we sort of talked about sharing some images and sharing some sort of experiences about what drew us to this subject and this interest. And maybe, I'm going to ask you to go first, if you don't mind, if that's okay with you, to sort of start jumping us off and leading us in this way.
Yeah, totally okay with me. I'm happy to leap in. So just so everyone knows, my name is Madeline. I'm a poet and a third-year PhD student in Concordia's Interdisciplinary Humanities program. My work focuses particularly on the intersections of art history, sensory studies, and neurodiversity and critical disability studies. I'm particularly interested in the fluidity and the porosity of the self, and particularly how Western ideals of atomized individualism and discrete personal identity are called into question by experiences that we've culturally labeled as illness or disability. I use these categories with the caveat that we always have to be wary of any binary between healthy, sick, or able, disabled, because anyone who is alive is vulnerable to illness, injury, and eventually death. So we're all at most temporarily abled. And so even bodies and minds that aren't medicalized have a lot to learn from critical disability studies. I was drawn to Sarah Ahmed's work in The Cultural Politics of Emotion, where she talks about bodies as constantly in flux and reshaped by contact they have with others. And in her view, these contacts and reshaping, they're not only metaphorical, but they're literal and they're lived. So we change our shapes literally as we move in a world with other bodies. And you can see this in inter-embodied dynamics, such as taking in food and these organisms we eat to sustain ourselves, as well as in factors such as access to medical care or health effects like environmental racism. So the self is both threatened by and sustained through others. And Ahmed writes that boundaries are only recognizable through the threat of transgression, which leads me to question if our cultural assumptions about the self become recognizable through the threat of that self's contamination. So I'm interested in illness and in art as spaces where the not me leaks into the me, and how it both destabilizes these categories and makes them visible. I'll share with an example of a sculptor whose work I really enjoy and find profoundly moving. Let's see how, if I can get this PowerPoint. Are you able to see my PowerPoint? Excellent. So this is a sculpture created by Gillian Genzer. She is a Toronto-based contemporary sculptor. And this is her sculpture Adam, after the first biblical man. And she's crafted it out of striated mussel shells and all these organisms. You can see a little bug of some sort in his chest. And through the 14 years in which Genzer was creating this sculpture, she was grinding down these mussel shells and breathing in the fragments, which led her to experience heavy metal poisoning, which had quite profound consequences neurologically and psychologically and physically. It had a lot of effects on her respiratory system and just her quality of life. But there wasn't any unidirectional relationship where she was shaping the sculpture and fully in control, or where the sculpture itself was fully in control. It was this very complex interplay of agency where both of them were altering one another on this bodily level. And the bodies of the muscles were also coming into play and reshaping their bodies. So we see here the way that Genzer's illness and this awareness of her physicality shaped how the sculpture took shape. We see Adam, his brain is created out of a butterfly pupa. His lungs are seashells. There's all these very, very intricate arrangements of animals and creatures that go in to create his organs. So just like how we are composed of the organisms that we eat and these nutrients we take in, so too is Adam's body dependent on and consistent of this world. So, and you can take out the different organs. And they're very, very intricate. It's only 14 inches tall, partly because of Genzer's physical illness required her to work on this very tiny scale. This is a self-portrait that Genzer worked after creating her sculpture of Adam. And it shows a bird that it's created out of desiccated fish gills and things that a bird might eat, but it's also inside, it includes a raccoon skull, which is a natural predator for birds. So this very complicated food chain relationship going on. She's created the internal organs of the bird, so you can see its reproductive system, its heart, and its brain. And interestingly, the brain is presented as damaged, which she spoke very directly to her own experiences of this. And she's created a new heart that is hatching, but there's also this profound ambivalence to it because the heart is created out of a spent bullet. And this is the only sort of non-natural material in it. So this bullet is both the source of damage to the bird and a constituent of the bird's body now that can't be cleanly separated. So she brings up very interesting ideas about contamination and what is the self versus what is a threat to the self. And my central thesis, I'd say, is that the self is not an entity, but an ecology.
Oh, that's wonderful. I really, yeah, I'm interested in this idea of contamination that you brought up, in the ways in which these sculptures sort of present this really blurriness, right? And what's so fascinating about the sculpture, and especially in dialogue with Ahmed, and that idea is like that moment of contact, right? Like, and I wonder, just before, I'll talk about my sort of work in a second, but before I get there, I'm just wondering about like how you sort of theorize that moment of contact in these sculptures, if that makes sense. They're so, to me, they're so blurry. I'm just wondering like how you tease that out.
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I feel like the contact, part of what complicates it is that it's not a precise moment, but just an ongoing experience that is constantly happening, and these bodies are constantly being shaped and reshaped. And there's never any moment where any one organism isn't in contact with its environment and being changed by it.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that, because I think that's exactly, or like a way to pull that out, right, is that it isn't, it seems blurry because it's happening so constantly, that you're always sort of rubbing and touching things. Yeah, I'll take a minute just to sort of give you, because I think there's something really interesting about contact and dialogue here, to give you a sense of where I'm coming from this, or towards these questions. I'm going to show you a far less beautiful image just to get this started. So you can see that? Yeah, so I am just, to introduce myself really quickly and to make Madeline and our conversation sort of keep going, is I'm an LTA assistant professor in the communication studies department. I did my PhD in the art history and communication studies department at McGill. And my research is mostly on sort of like bad feelings. I'm interested in anxiety and loneliness, and how they circulate and how they sort of separate or like inscribe experiences of selfhood, right? So our experiences of feeling anxious or lonely, and how those in turn help us understand or cultivate ourselves. And I tend to approach the idea of subjectivity from a like pretty classical communication studies and media studies approach, which is, Madeline, when you said, this dividing line between me and not me is one of these kind of points of contact for our conversation, because I look at text, there's a John Durham Peters text where he talks about William James, and William James sort of says famously that the world is divided into two spheres, and that's me and not me. And it's a different place for everybody, but this is the same thing. And John Durham Peters, in response to that, says that this is actually like a pretty historically novel idea, that the world wasn't always divided between subject and object and self and other. And to varying degrees, communication is supposed to be this mediation, right? This thing that allows us to talk across these boundaries. And so it becomes both like a fantasy of perfect dialogue and perfect conversations, but also there's fears of communication that you might be brainwashed, or like telepathy, right? Like things that can come in. And so I'm really interested in where we cut the subject from the environment, how we create or enforce these boundaries and what that means. And so this image on the screen, this sort of blurry pixelated image that I'm showing you, is a screenshot of a suicide, and which is taken from a live stream. I'm not going to show an image of a suicide here. It's not a great way to start a conversation. But what I want to draw attention to is the pixelation and the boundary lines that are drawn here. And what initially drew me towards these images was that you were seeing in a live stream of a suicide like a binary cut, a point where life moved from existent to non-existent. And then as those images were mediafied, that's not a great word, but as they were sort of transformed into media, as a live stream is sort of screenshotted and saved as a JPEG, you start to pick up these artifacts and these like boundaries between one point and the other. And so my interest in containment and these points of contact that you describe come largely from the ways in which media are used to constitute boundary points. Another way I think about this, you know, the pixel is one version, right, where the colors start to, because we're trying to make them look the same, they start to cut off. But another way I think about this is even just in practices of like journal writing, where you sort of try to externalize yourself via writing, perhaps to get control over yourself, right? Because being out of control is scary. And so you try to create these sort of like media structures to create boundaries to control you. So I think there's, I mean, yeah, I think this idea of contamination and boundary is really engaging. And yeah, I mean, I guess like to keep this going, yeah, I'm interested in the forms that those take, the sort of places where we make that cut. And I mean, I love your approach of thinking about it as ecological. And I think that I come at this as sort of wondering about what the drive is for a cut, you know, like why we need to sort of constitute the self and others different forces and what comes from that. So I'm going to stop sharing this so we can see each other again. There we go.
Wow, that is so fascinating. Like your idea of social media and the circulating of images, it does make me think of that ecology and how perhaps the internet can be an environment in itself where you have all these different participants interacting. And I found that the artifacts in that was very fascinating. Sounds like too simplistic a word, but very thought-provoking. It made me think of Sarah Ahmed's discussion of affects as impressions and how she uses the word impressions, basing it off Hume's use of this term to refer to how an impression is simultaneously something that you think and your mind sort of making particularly affective connections. But an impression is also something that impresses upon your skin and is physically felt in your body. And it is the mark of something that's been transmitted through time and been touched and engaged with. And it's interesting, we usually think of the internet as so non-physical, and yet this image to me is very saturated with impressions and maybe artifacts as a kind of impression.
Yeah, I think that's really, yeah, I mean, I like, one of the things that's so fascinating to me about like the sculptures and like the sculptures in these images and the vocabulary of these points of contact is like how I think we have like, I often use the cut to describe what I'm trying to get at, you know, like this really sort of violent cut between the subject and the other. And then impression is a much nicer way to think about the like pushes upon and sort of like, you know, like Ahmed, every time you think about impression, you know, I can't help but think about how we impress upon each other, right? This like really sort of like literally impress, you know, and we feel these things. And I think that, I mean, it's interesting, right? Just to try to tease out that like softer vocabulary for how we might blur or bend together in different places. I wonder, one of the things that I think is really interesting in Gensler and in your work too is, and this is maybe you can be back to both of us, but it is the ways in which you develop sort of, you think about neurotypicality and sort of like these models of the subject that can be divergent, right? That like, I think that sometimes we're really stuck in positions of subjectivity. And when I was watching your thing, I was thinking, I feel like, do you know the Amanda Baggs, the In My Language video?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that video. I don't know for people who are here if anyone's seen this, but it's a relatively well-known and sort of well-discussed video in disability studies where Amanda Baggs she's on the autism spectrum, and she describes her experiences of engaging with the environment, right? It's sort of a self, she's non-vocal, right? So she sort of like writes it down, but she's talking about how she experiences the world as a type of language and how she interacts with objects in these different ways. So I think that, I mean, this is sort of a question, but yeah, when you use sort of, or when you think about like neuroatypicality and these other types of engagements, does that help you sort of better understand or map these boundaries?
I don't know if it makes the boundaries clearer, but if it makes any sense, it makes the unclarity more evident in a way that I find productive. Because part of the interesting question about sort of the way we understand neurodiversity is that historically it's been framed in very problematic ways, where, for example, it was portrayed that a person with autism, somewhere in them was a neurotypical person trying to communicate, and that they were inhibited by their lack of language or their dyspraxia or things like that. And then we have the neurodiversity movement coming in and saying that, no, this isn't a neurotypical person who is inhibited. This is a different person whose own sensorium is equally valuable and who's engaging with the world in their own rich way, and who, rather than being cut off from meaningful relationships, they're enacting relationships in a different way.
Yeah.
And I find that raises really interesting questions about how we constitute the self, because so many of our models of selfhood and what it means to be a person, they're based on neurotypical models, which are not only is it a construction of the healthcare system, but it's a construction of the capitalist system and of Western culture, where some senses are very highly valued and others aren't really attended to. So you might have a person who's non-vocal but has a really rich way of expressing themselves otherwise. And in more logocentric systems, it's often portrayed as this person is somehow lacking something in their self, or the self is being cut off and separated. But neurodiverse frameworks can recognize senses such as touch and movement as also being relational. That might have gone off from your question.
Oh, that's great, because I love exactly that sort of moment in the video where she says, like, people think I'm in my own world, right? This idea where sort of these, like, neurodiversity is read as being out of touch with the environment, but it could actually be like deeply enmeshed within and experiencing that. Marlene, I saw you pop in. Yes.
Yeah, I just thought I'd pop in and just bring more questions into the discussion. But then it's also time for our other panelists to join us in a minute as well. I actually had a question for both of us on what you've been talking about. And so that is kind of the idea of, so Helmut Plessner has written in his book in 1927, which only recently was translated into English, about sort of the kind of exactly that me and not me, sort of this boundary between the actual physical being and the environment, and sort of question that boundary. And I was curious, sort of in both cases, that what you talked about, you know, on the one hand, you show this very pixelated image, Christopher, this sort of kind of melding of something, one space into another, whether it's a physical space into something that doesn't look physical, but also what you showed, Madeleine, about sort of the contaminations or the contaminants that enter that artist's body. So is there a boundary, or is it just a boundary that we all kind of imagine to what end, really? And that's kind of sort of the question that I want to put out there. And Marie, just our next panelist, joined as well, so I let her introduce her.
Yeah.
Sure. Hi. We can address all these questions all at once. That would be fun. So to introduce myself, I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at Concordia University, and I work on marine symmetries and the convergence between human death and environmental death. But like for this talk, we're trying to like have this kind of improvised responses between panelists, and so I would be more interested in discussing issues of contamination as they arise in this discussion already. And what I found interesting between your two talks is this perhaps difference between contamination in Madeleine's topic and maybe the notion of virality in your talk, Christopher, because it's about like the live streaming of suicidal performances. So is there like, that's more of a theoretical question about what are the different, like the distinctions between the two. It seems to me that virality is more about like the speed of the spread of a phenomenon, and contamination implies this notion of immunity, as Madeleine, you pointed out, in a sense. So I have so many questions, but I will keep it kind of short because we're so many. But like Madeleine, for example, your talk reminded me of another author, which I don't know if you know. If not, then that's not as relevant maybe. But her name is Stacy Alemo, and she talks about more like environmental contamination, and she draws from Rosie Raidotti, and she calls for some kind of insurgent, submersive imminence of becoming with the environment. So she also challenges the notion of self as being this kind of bounded object, and rather looks at, in more relational, terms. And so she kind of covers resistance movements, demonstrations that also perform and stage this kind of blurred relationality between the human and the non-human. But the question I have listening to your talk in relation to Stacy Alemo's work, let's say, is to what extent those understandings, even if very potent politically, also may renaturalize the body and the environment. So I don't know if this is something you address in your research or not. And second question, maybe this time for Christopher, I was wondering so many things about your research actually. And speaking of this virality of suicidal performances, to what extent this virality also is self-reinforcing, fuels even more suicidal, actions, and to what extent that also comes from some kind of toxic politics, in the sense that people coming to perform is also maybe to get some kind of attention that have been denied politically. And so then if that's the case, what would be the kind of political modes we could imagine to, not resolve, because you do speak about the resolution as problematic in the sense, like playing with this notion of image and the pixel. So how could we remediate those performances? And the last thing I had in mind, just as because we're workshopping ideas here, but would it be something imaginable to invite, I don't know how you would recruit, but invite youth that is at risk, let's say, of committing suicide, to stage their death in a way that really, they don't do it to themselves, but they still perform it and stage it also in a way to work on this idea of self and perform also a kind of rebirth. And this has to all the panelists' work. So I'll stop here and see where that leads us.
Yeah, no, if I can sort of jump in, because I think that's a really wonderful and interesting question. And it makes me think also, Marilyn, of your question about the boundaries and whether they're real or not, because how do I sort of frame this? I think this could also invite our the other panelists, because I think that one of the things in my work that I try to think about is media as perhaps like a technology of boundary making, that it is sort of the thing that kind of constitutes these lines that are there. Fintan in the really wonderful introduction to this said, this is what we lose on Zoom, all of the conversations in the hallway and the different passing moments. And so sort of an anecdote about Zoom that I think will help illustrate my point. But I was teaching a class recently, and we were playing a song on Zoom, and the song is purposefully sort of cacophonous and loud and noisy. And when it gets noisy, Zoom immediately cuts it, right? Because Zoom has noise filtering algorithms that don't allow a lot of background noise. So any sort of excess above a threshold gets filtered out. And so when I think of media, I often think of it as the sort of our little cubes here, where we're framed in these little contained boxes that stop these spreads. And when I think of, so to return then to, and this is maybe an open question for other people about what contains or stops or builds these boundaries in your work. But when I return to this idea of the suicide and its virality, because Marie, you're very right that it's well documented that there is a sort of contagious affective spread of suicide, right? They come in clusters and they move in these ways, and performances of suicide online tend to invoke other performances. They repeat in different places. And so, containment then becomes a public health measure in some sense, right? How can we stop the spread of these movements? And I think that, on one hand, there's a biopolitical logic here. On the other hand, one of the things that drew me into these performances was performance art, which was the artist Chris Burden has a performance where he gets shot. you know, like where he gets his friend to shoot himself in the arm as part of a performance and then documents that. And you say, well, what's this one and what's that one? So all to say, I don't have a great answer for your really good suggestion about virality, but I think there's a couple of ways to think about it. But also, I mean, I would maybe invite a conversation about other people thinking about like containers or like these technologies of containment. Because I think I know Marie, it's in your work. I think Addie, I saw it in your work as well. I think it shows up, and Emily actually, between cities, I think it shows up in a lot of our work is sort of what allows these lines to be drawn. So I don't know.
So building on that, my work was mentioned. So my name is Emily, and I'm a master's student in the biology department in the Zeter Lab of Urban Landscape Ecology. And I feel so far we've had quite a bit of discussion about whether these boundaries exist and how we impact each other. But I'd like to pose a question that really tethers this into a very practical sense to everyone. So no matter how we look at this, I think we can all somewhat agree that our actions impact our environment and our environment impacts ourselves. So for example, I'm an urban ecologist. We decide how to build cities, we construct an environment, but then the way we construct a city might cause things like air pollution that affect our lungs. So I'd like to ask this very practical question to my fellow panelists. What responsibility do we have to ourselves to take good care of the environment? And what responsibility do we have to the environment to take good care of ourselves?
I mean, I have a hunch, but I wonder if other people want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, this raises so many interesting points. And, you know, as you talk, I was thinking about the instances of symbiotic architectures or anarchitectures, in the sense that they're not here so much to regulate and aside of capitalist extraction as urbanism as long and is about. But as you know, instances of architecture that really brings about this co-relationship. So there is so many examples of this, but there's this one instance in Marseille, this architecture company, Tangram Lab, they designed a symbiotic archipelago that is meant to invite colonization by fish and other kind of marine species, while also providing human space. And this works through you know, human waste being recycled through in ways that feed into bioluminescent algae that, you know, produce light. So they have like this different kind of co-productions mechanism that are at place, while also protecting the shores in many different ways. I can also share this kind of link below, but as you speak, this is the kind of, you know, practical ways of like imagining symbiotic modes of existence, technically.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of, my name is Matthew, I'm from the philosophy department. And I also kind of wanted to jump in response to your question, Emily, because I think it ties back to some of the stuff that Madeline was saying. One of the themes that I've noticed already popping up in this talk is the idea of the relationship to alterity or the outside. And the way that it's been discussed up till now is kind of on an oppositional framework of the I and the not I. And I think there's actually a reason to think, especially from an ecological perspective, that idea of the I and the not I are actually insufficient for thinking the kinds of differentiation that are parts of ecologies. And so in a way, the question between the self and the environment is actually about a relationship of a multiplicity of ecologies interacting. And so the responsibility is somehow along the lines of this where there is no clear border and maybe just points of communication and disruption or something like that. So I think that ties back into what I saw in your abstract as well, between the nature culture divide, because I think one way we can think about the nature culture divide is we can try and renaturalize human beings or something like that, or reintegrate in some way. But I also think perhaps in a more interesting method is to destabilize or make uncertain the nature culture divide itself, because the idea of there's a kind of relation of artifactuality, I think, as you point out, like in nature, and the kind of the interaction of those artifactual ecologies within nature, within human culture is really, I think, where the responsibility lies, is to think about those things in some fashion. So.
Thank you for that, Matthew. That was so eloquent, and I really love your idea about the multiplicity of ecologies interacting. Emily, in response to your question, I think it's a really great question, and in my personal view, I think that the concrete and the abstract aren't always as separate as we think they are. And if we consider the self as a multiplicity of ecologies, this can have meaningful concrete changes in terms of how we relate to our environment and to one another. So for example, while we might think of a person as like a discrete individual, like I might say, oh, this is me, I am this particular person. But if I look on a molecular level, then there's no clear divide between what is me and what isn't. Like, are the bacteria in my body that help it to function properly a part of me? Is the oxygen that I breathe in, like the food that I eat, at what point is that another organism and at what point is it me? And I don't think there is any clear divide, and in a way, I don't think there needs to be, but because that acknowledgement of interdependency is itself vital to our survival. And I think, I'm not sure if that goes a bit off of your question, but I think you're very right that there need to be concrete ways of recontextualizing our engagement with the world around us to be something more sustainable.
I love that response, and I would even maybe elaborate not just that things like maybe the bacteria in our gut are part or not part of ourselves or something in between, but also ourselves in relation to the ecosystems we live in, that we are a part of the cities we live in and the environments we live in. It's a nice little paradigm shift to have.
Yeah, I'm also interested in this question. So I'm a philosophy student, and I work on like analytic approaches to especially classical Indian philosophy, and the work I'm doing now is about a philosopher called Nagarjuna, who's very important for the Buddhist tradition. And this isn't exactly what I work on, but anytime you begin working on a Buddhist philosopher, you have to tackle with one of their core doctrines, which is the no self doctrine. And the Buddhist philosophers are often charged for being nihilists for this reason in the classical Indian debates by rival philosophical schools, especially the Nyaya. And I'm not sure if this is the exact direction Emily was going with her question, but I am interested in this idea of ethical obligation. If you could say that there is no bearer of ethical responsibility, is it even possible for there to be ethical obligation for the no self? And I thought Madeline's response was sort of interesting because it reframes the no self dichotomy as a process. And I think this is a pretty valuable insight into where ethical responsibility could come from. And especially so, like, there's Evan Thompson has a book where this is essentially his thesis, is that he deals with classical Indian doctrines on the self amongst rival schools across different mental states, like waking, dreaming, and sleeping. And his last chapter, he talks about exactly this, sort of breaking through this dichotomy to understand the self as a process. Now, he doesn't do this for ethical reasons. He does this for sort of other reasons, but I think this is a promising way to think about the ethical obligation.
That's so great. I really love that.
Yeah, I'll hop in again on the question of responsibility. I realized I forgot to introduce my research, so I was so excited to just jump in. So I'll just say a little bit. I study Derrida and Levinas, so these questions of alterity and responsibility in particular are very close to my heart. And I just think one of the ways we've been talking about in terms of the relationship to alterity and perhaps the moment of insecurity or uncertainty is the moment where responsibility emerges as being kind of necessary and perhaps also in a certain sense impossible from the perspective of an obligation or a calculated program of certainty. And I think responsibility thought in an ecological manner is a play of call and response that moves across this kind of site of instability where things are disrupting and disrupted and the boundaries are not yet settled. And so maybe that's an important sense in which to think the necessity of a response in the first place is a kind of opening up that requires, that calls upon the agents, or however you want to conceptualize it, as needing to bring something to the situation.
Yeah, I want to jump in there because I think there's I really like the reminder about like sort of the precariousness of these relationships, that they are always so sort of delicate and finite, and that urgency often emerges from like the existential threat, right? That like at this moment where we feel ourselves maybe perhaps bumping into the boundaries, we feel the most aware of trying to think about this. This is a silly sort of example, but it comes from a former student of mine who once brought this up, but you may, I don't know if people have seen the movie Titanic, but at the end of the movie Titanic, Jack and Rose end up floating in the ocean on this piece of wood. And this moment is really wonderful in some sense because it reveals something like ontological. Like at that moment, like ontology is basically technology, and nature and culture are one and the same. You can't really, like without the piece of wood, without the piece of the ship, they do not exist. And suddenly the precariousness of this is there, and you're like opened up to the fact that, yeah, like ethics becomes, like it's, I'm not even sure, like this is where the Derrida Levinas scholar might help, but like I'm not even sure if we get into ethics when we get into this moment of just like existence, and this really precarious balancing act between the world and, again, like I always find binaries, that's like my training, so I'm always like, yes, there's this cut here, but yeah, between the world and the self, but at that moment when you are in that floating in the ocean on a piece of wood, there's no boundary, I don't think, or if there is, it's, yeah, you're holding on to some like last vestiges of the subject, I think. So.
Yeah, I think just I'll respond to that quickly, and I want to hear kind of what other people have to say about this kind of thing. But I think maybe one way to think about the call to responsibility, and it has to do with the moment of contact, which was thematized kind of at the beginning of this, and perhaps the shock of the contact. You know, one of the things that really struck me when I was thinking about the case that you brought forward of the repetition of the image after the instant of death, is what the meaning of that instant is, right? Because we have the meaning produced by the repetition, and the instant itself seems in a certain sense inaccessible to thought. And so that's a kind of limit where like uncertainty is produced, and it's produced, as you say, existentially or ontologically in the form of death, right? And I think it's important that one of the things that we can think about is the instant as the moment of uncertainty or as the moment of insecurity. Because I think that's where a decision in the sense of like a cut or a decision between life and death really emerges at the level of the instant. And it seems exempt somehow from repetition, like the iterability of it, something is lost, right? And that's the singular life that is the thing that is exposed. So yeah.
Tying into that, you know, I was wondering if the concept of boundary or the piece of wood in the Titanic is less something that, you know, create a separation, but also, as you said, like the zone of contact that is at play. So maybe, you know, this leads us to think less maybe in terms of containment, like this is a concept you mentioned earlier, Christopher, but more maybe in terms of modulation. So how do you stay in this in-between? How do you channel this viral streams of suicidal performance without actually containing it? Because this is, it's one point that is, I think, interesting here is like there are so many instances where when trying to contain contamination, whatever issues whether it's environmental, social, whatever it is, those acts also kind of fuel the process at play. So let's say in the case of suicidal performances, for instances, to what extent actually containing or like censoring those performances may trigger another kind of wish for getting attention. I don't know what that would trigger, but we can imagine that this will not stop the desire for spectacular attention this creates. And in so many, I mean, we can think of other examples. So like then it becomes a question of like, what are the modes of resistance we can imagine in the ways that rechannel and remediate rather than stop what cannot be stopped, really.
So I'm just going to just to announce to everyone that like we're now upgrading all audience members to panelists so that they can butt in if they like, is a thing. If somebody has a point or a burning point, they can certainly talk. I want to keep the conversation going though. Amongst all of you, it's been great so far. It's been a real wall of ideas in some sense. Certainly, actually, just my own question that's been come up now is certainly just from what you were saying, Marie, with the question of containment. I'm wondering what are like, given the different things that have been brought in, what are the resources for thinking through kind of this problem? What resources do we have from our various different perspectives? You know, like Adi, you mentioned the kind of concept of emptiness that kind of comes through in Mahayana Buddhism, I believe. There's the integration of materials foreign to us. Madeline, you were talking about that. Or even say when Emily, we're talking about say like the various kind of like attempts to think this through in the ecological sciences between distinctions between, or rather what the urban ecology represents. There's others too as well, but but I'll leave it there just to kind of as a provocation for the last moment of the conversation.
Yeah, that's so fascinating and so many rich ideas to think about. When you were talking, Marie, it made me think a bit about sort of connections possibly between Christopher and Aditya's ideas about spaces of contact. And as we see in experiences of suicide and self-harm, there's often a state of profound alienation and emptiness that the person is experiencing. But I wonder if we might, sort of following Aditya's analysis, approach emptiness as something that isn't inherently pathological and isn't inherently something wrong with this individual person, but more that this is just evidence that people cannot exist in a vacuum, and that these spaces of contact between people are necessary for us to sustain our existence. And I wonder if these sort of self-representations through the performance of suicide are paradoxically, even though it's a form of self-extinction, it's making the self present and known to others in this very acute way. And I'm just, I guess, building on that or following that thread, thinking about how there could be alternatives to present these very extreme materializations if the person was able to make contact with others and experience a sense of being in relationship rather than this alienation.
If I can make maybe a little bit of a counterpoint to that line of thinking, I'd like to ask the audience as well as the panelists, are there ever situations where it's actually necessary to create a boundary between the self and the other? Because we've been talking a lot about how maybe that boundary is mushy or doesn't exist, but maybe there are some situations where we need it to exist.
Yeah, I really like this question, and I was just wondering, maybe this is a question for Christopher. I was thinking of you work on suicide and this idea that perhaps individual rights might sometimes be at odds with what we've been talking about, interdependency and the lack of boundaries and emptiness and these sorts of things. And is it possible that individual and human rights might ever be at odds? Because I'm thinking of, like, I'm sure there are other philosophers that have talked about this, but Schopenhauer, for example, on the right to suicide and how he thinks the Western philosophy up to that point has been infiltrated with Christianity to the point where suicide has been seen as a sin, but rather it really shouldn't be seen as a sin. We should have autonomous right to our own body, and we should have agency over that. But if I'm at all influenced by the conversation we're having, it would seem that a person's choice to kill themselves would affect others in a great way. So is there ever an odds between, and like Madeline also talked about the implications of the atomic individual, and I'm thinking that the understanding of the atomic individual has led to a lot of great ethical movements in the West. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wonder if there's, to see if we can try to talk about all of these really interesting threads, because I think, I mean, to start with, yeah, I think that like these models of sort of Western subjectivity as like, you know, at least at some point, like rooted on like independent self-creating man, yeah, have sparked political movements and have also obviously come with great harms across all sorts of different spectrums. And so, yeah, this balancing act between these two is really interesting. I think that, yeah, to say, like, to talk to Emily and Madeline and Marie's original sort of question about modulation and these things is that one of the, you know, like reading the online performance is really fraught, right? Because I think it starts obviously with what is like this really enormous question, which is somebody's life is ended. This is not, you know, a performance art piece. This is not these other sort of words of doing this or ways of doing this or approaching it. At the same time, I find that like some art history methods are valuable in thinking about this sort of ontological or existence question, which is, you know, in art history, you have a performance and the performance comes with documentation, and then the documentation allows us to understand the performance. And I think that sort of Marie's question about the spectacularness of this is one about like whether we verify the life through its documentation, you know, like how do we verify the ontological status of the person? And in some sense, it's the like residual things they left behind. I mean, I'm not fully invested in this argument, and I'm happy to hear other people sort of engage with it. But there's a way in which, yeah, like I once had a friend say that they wanted somebody to witness their life, which I thought was both very interesting and very strange. But I think this sort of existence is part of it, right? Like, what do you leave behind? What materials do you leave? And I think in a strange way, this transforms, this is like Foucault and a few other people, but life becomes a work of art, an aesthetic sort of engagement where what you're doing is producing these materials. And there's something beautiful about that, but there's also something fraught about that sort of engagement. And yeah, I mean, I'm not totally convinced then about, which is, sorry, let me reframe this finally to go to Emily's point about the boundary, which is that sometimes these boundaries are technologies of aesthetics too, or ways of creating an aesthetic image, right? Like I mentioned when I first started this, talking about, for example, like journal writing and other sort of ways of engaging with the self. And yeah, I do research on anxiety and loneliness and these things. And if you've ever had a panic attack, you know, if you've ever been really anxious, the first thing you are told to do therapeutically is like calm down, think about your realistic options, and then often like write them, you know, like write out what's going on and write these things. And this becomes boundary policing to my mind. It's sort of a mediation of the self and what's going on. I think really helpful in desperate moments, right? And can help you start breathing and calming down. But also is maybe exactly the technology of the Madeline and Eddie get to about like separation and about this sort of like rupture here that might make you feel more alone. So I'm again at a, like, I'm not at a, there's no satisfying conclusion at the end of this point, other than just, we're still sort of stuck figuring out what we can do in these spaces. Yeah.
It just made me think of something, you know, this example give of writing out, you know, what's going through you. And the same as, you know, this maybe idea of staging your death in a way that you actually don't die. Those are instances where, you know, you become beside yourself in a sense. So it's not so much about dissolving the sense, getting rid of the self, but having it just like beside and having this kind of, I don't know if it's not necessarily reflexivity, but yeah, you get out of yourself a little bit. And I don't know to what extent the school of Buddhism that you study, Aditya, is also like really challenges this, like a Judeo-Christian concept of the self, obviously, that is very much, you know, ingrained in many things we talked.
I was thinking in response to both Emily's points, regarding when it might be useful to draw a boundary or when it might perhaps be necessary. An example that came to mind was such as acute states of panic or experiences like psychotic depression, where a person is thinking very differently than they normally would think. And it becomes very difficult then to classify, are these the person's thoughts or are these the disorder's thoughts, with the sort of medical framing that the disorder is something separate from the person, which is of course very fraught and has a lot of problems thinking about it that way. But it also has a lot of problems if you think about it as an undifferentiated part of the person, because these might be behaviors and actions that really wouldn't reflect upon their usual modes of being in the world. So I think there it can potentially be both useful and problematic to draw that divide, sort of I don't remember who it was who used the phrase necessary and impossible, but I was thinking about that. Like, it's never going to be a neat divide, but just for pragmatic purposes, sometimes it can be helpful in the moment. And I think that also has sort of implications for the concept of agency and humans' rights to particular behaviors, because I think someone who's self-harming while they're in a psychotic state, that's very different than someone who, say, has a terminal illness and they've thought this through.
Okay. So on this question, although I'm going to say of drawing a boundary or drawing a division, we're going to have to close it down. Thank you very much for that last conversation, and to all of our participants today. Marlena, do you have anything to add, or is a thing? Or
yeah, I mean, you sparked like a lot of ideas. I mean, I had even more questions. I also like to Matthew about idea of transcendental healing and like the problems of, you know, ontological idea of self and all, you know, there are many more. But we would like to mention that we have 2 more events coming up as part of the Expanded Dialogues. There are slightly different themes, but they still on the idea of on the question of self uncertainties. The next one will take place on May 13th. I believe that's a Thursday, again at 2:30. And so really we invite people to submit their abstracts or their ideas for these discussions through our website, which you can find at the Center for Expanded Poetics webpage, the CEP. There's a projects and events page. And the last one is on June 14th, and that will be dealing with sort of the idea of the molecular self and generally what does the molecular define in us, something that Madeline brought up as well. And we just realized actually that Fintan and I did not introduce ourselves, so we are the organizers who keep sort of semi-moderating in the background and sometimes throw questions out. But just to give you an idea, you know, I'm a second-year PhD student at the Department of English at Concordia. I'm also a part of the CEP, and I'm also in my other life a scientist, so I'm very interested in interdisciplinary studies. Fintan, do you want to introduce yourself as well quickly?
Yes, my name is Fintan Nealon. I'm doing a PhD in philosophy, and I'm also a research intern at the Center for Expanded Poetics, which is, I should pass on both our thanks to the Center for Expanded Poetics for hosting, as well as to Anna and Doug from Fourth Space, who have been working on the machinery in the background and keeping everything running, as well as thanks to the Faculty of Art and Science for support, very generous support. As Marlena said, our next event, I think I just shared it in the chat box there, but you can also get it on the Center for Expanded Poetics website. Our next event is May 13th with the title of Fractured Communication, Fragmented Society. We've already very much broached on some of those topics here, so I really hope it'll be continuous onto there and then onto our third event. But that's it from me anyway. So thank you very much again, both to all our participants, the audience for coming, as well as those who hosted us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you both. And I do believe this is the first event where we did introductions at the very end, which was a nice little spin. And I just wanted to thank our audience as well, who kind of came on this experiment with us. We wanted to see what it would feel like to kind of move from the audience into being a panelist. And while we had so many great folks here ready, on the ready to have a conversation, it's great to hear your feedback in the chat now. So thanks for coming on this journey with us, and thank you all for the experiment. I think next time we might need to go a little bit longer because there's so many great ideas and so much to say.
Absolutely, yes. And I hope the panelists will join us as well again then for the next events, because we would love to have you.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Unfortunately, when we close the webinar, we say goodbye to everybody at the same time. No debriefing here. So we wish you a good afternoon, and we will look forward to seeing you again on May 13th. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Bye.